They keep asking me what I was thinking when I put my hands under that thing. Truth is, I wasn't thinking. Not really. There's a moment when the thinking stops and something older takes over, something that lived in us long before we ever built ships. I've tried to explain it to the coalition psychologists 3 times now, and they keep writing the same word in their notes. Anomalous. Like I'm a weather pattern. Like I'm a crack in the hull they need to name before they can weld it shut. But you asked, and you're not one of them, so I'll tell it straight. My name is Odell Krayne. I was a hauler second on the Bramble Verity, a hull the shape of a dropped brick and about as beautiful, running low-tier freight through the sepulchre reach for a company that lost money in 11 currencies at once. I was 34. I had a bad shoulder from a cargo net that snapped in dock and a habit of humming when I was nervous, which annoyed everyone I ever worked with. I was not a soldier. I want that clear before anything else. I was not brave. I was a man who moved boxes for a living, and who had, at that point in his life, never once been looked at by anyone important. And then the Empress of the Vel-Tarrin came to Kessa Hollow, and the ground opened under her, and I was standing about 40 meters away with a ration bar in my mouth. Let me back up. Kessa Hollow wasn't a planet. Nobody called it that even though it technically qualified. It was a moon with delusions, a wet gray rock orbiting a gas giant nobody had bothered to name past a catalog number, and the only reason anything lived there was the tunnels. Kessite. You've probably got some in your teeth if you've ever had dental work done off-world. It's a mineral that doesn't corrode, doesn't fatigue, doesn't do anything except sit there being perfect forever. And the only known deposit in 11 systems ran through the guts of that miserable moon like veins through a leg. So they dug. 12 species dug. The Vel-Tarrin owned the rights, the Goron did the extraction, the Melee ran the assay houses, and humans, well. Humans hauled. That's what we were for. Nobody ever said it out loud in the treaty language, but you learn a thing's shape by where it's put. We got the cargo runs nobody else wanted, the deep shaft supply drops, the long dead hours in the low corridors where the air recyclers wheezed and the light came out gray. We were cheap. We didn't ask questions, and we were, this is the part they'd say with a little laugh, a little tilt of whatever they had instead of a head, resilient. Resilient, that's a word you use about a weed. I'd been on Kessa 9 months. 9 months of the same 3 streets in the shipping district, the same wet air that tasted like coins, the same shift horn at 500 that sounded like an animal dying badly. I shared a bunk block with 4 other haulers. 2 of them were human. One was a Goron named Vess who'd been demoted for something he wouldn't discuss, and who taught me to play a card game I never once won. The 4th was a Melee kid who slept upside down in a hammock and cried in his sleep, and none of us ever mentioned it in the morning, because that's the kindness you can afford when you have nothing else. That was my life. That was the whole of it, and I'd have lived it out and died in it, and you'd never have heard my name. Except the Empress came. You have to understand what that meant. The Vel-Tarrin don't travel. That's not an exaggeration or a story I'm dressing up. Their ruling line hadn't left the cradle worlds in 240 years. They govern through the hollow voice, a relay system that carries their will out across the territories in a signal so precisely encoded that it arrives with the tone intact, so that when the Empress is displeased, every receiver in 11 systems feels the temperature of it. They are not a species that shows up. They are a species that is conveyed. And then the hollow voice said she was coming to Kessa, in person, body and blood. The reason was politics I only half understood and half misremember now. Something about a succession dispute. Something about her needing to be seen touching the source of her house's wealth, so that the cousins back home would remember whose name was on the deed. Vess explained it to me over cards, and I nodded like I was following and then lost 11 credits. But whatever the reason, the effect on Kessa Hollow was like someone lit a fire under a pot. They repainted things. I'm not joking. They sent crews out to repaint the corridor walls in the upper district, which nobody had done in 40 years, and the paint didn't match the old paint, so the whole place looked like a healing bruise. They rerouted the sewage lines that ran under Processional 9 because someone realized her convoy would pass over them and the smell wasn't appropriate. They confiscated 3,000 tons of unregistered cargo, mine included, and I spent 2 days filling out forms in a language I couldn't read, while a mellow clerk clicked his mandibles at me in what I'm fairly sure was amusement. And they built the road. That's the thing that matters. That's the thing this whole story hangs on, so let me take my time with it. The Vel-Tarrin Empress does not walk. She does not ride. She is carried in the sarcophage. That's the closest translation. It's a state carriage, and calling it a carriage is like calling an ocean a puddle. 240 meters long, 11 decks. It moves on a bed of contained gravitic distortion, floating half a meter off whatever surface it crosses, and it weighs, well, that's the joke, isn't it? That's the whole joke. It weighs nothing because it's floating. Until it isn't. The sarcophage is a shell of solid velorite, an alloy so dense that a cubic meter of it would crush a human ribcage into paste if you dropped it from a table. It's covered in the ancestral reliefs, 2,000 years of carved history, every empress, every conquest, every treaty, all of it in raised relief, gold-veined, unimaginable. And inside it there's a throne and a court, and an atmosphere pumped to cradle world specification, and enough machinery to run a small city. Displacement mass, fully loaded, somewhere north of 41,000 tons. 41,000 tons, held up by a gravitic bed that runs off 8 redundant cores, floating half a meter off the ground. That's what came down out of the sky on the 8th of 5th month, in the rain, while I stood in a crowd eating a ration bar and thinking about absolutely nothing. The rain on Kessa was always vertical. No wind down in the hollow, nothing to push it sideways, so it just fell, straight and gray and endless, and it made a sound on the corridor roofs like someone frying meat 2 rooms away. It had been falling for 11 days. It would fall for 11 more. That was Kessa. They'd cleared the processional at dawn. Every shop shuttered, every cargo lane blocked, and they herded us. The workers, the haulers, the mine crews coming off shift with the dust still on them, into pens along the sides. Actual pens. Barriers of hummed light, chest high, and behind them about 11,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder in the wet. Ves was next to me. He was Goron, big, plated, 4 eyes in a row across a face like the front of a shovel, and he'd been on Kessa 11 years and he was bored out of his mind. "You know what this is," he said. "A parade." "It's a bill." He shifted his weight. The rain ran off his plating in little rivers. "Every hour this district is shut is 900,000 in lost extraction, and they'll take it out of the shift bonuses. Watch. You could try enjoying it. I could try eating my own foot." He said something in Goron that the translator rendered as "the sky is a landlord," which I've thought about for 11 years and still don't fully understand. The Galactic Guard lined the route. That was the other thing, the thing that made your stomach go tight even if you didn't know why. Vel-Tarrin Household Guard. Not the ordinary garrison, the household. They stood every 8 meters down the full length of Processional 9, 200 of them on each side, and they did not move. I don't mean they stood still. Everybody's seen soldiers stand still. I mean they did not move. Their armor was a matte non-color that seemed to eat the rain rather than shed it, sealed head to foot, no face, no visor, just a smooth blank curve where a face should have been. They carried a weapon I don't have a name for, a long thing, no barrel, no obvious mechanism, held across the body in a grip that suggested it didn't need aiming so much as permitting. And they didn't shift, didn't adjust, didn't blink obviously, but also didn't do the 100 small things a living body does when it's been holding a position for 6 hours. No weight transfer, no breath swell, nothing. I watched one for maybe 20 minutes just to see. Ves noticed. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Stare at them, they log it. They can't see me. There's 11,000. They log everything. He tilted a couple of eyes toward the nearest one, then away. They're not looking, they're recording. There's a difference and it matters. He was quiet for a second. I saw one break formation once, in Goron space. A juvenile ran into the road. What happened? It moved 11 meters, put the child on the curb, and went back to its mark. He said it flat. The whole thing took under 2 seconds. I don't mean it was fast, I mean I didn't see it happen. I saw it standing there, and then I saw it standing there, and the child was on the curb. His plates clicked. That is what they are. Don't stare. I stopped staring. I want to be honest here. I was scared of them. Everyone was. It wasn't a dramatic fear. It was the low background kind, the kind you get in a room with a large dog you don't know. And there was something else under it that I couldn't name then and can name now. They were better than us. Everyone knew it. Faster, stronger, older, richer, wired into machinery we couldn't understand, standing in the rain like statues while 11,000 of us shivered and shuffled and stank behind a light barrier. That's not resentment talking. That's just an inventory. And when you live inside an inventory like that long enough, you stop noticing you're in it. You just carry it, like a bad shoulder. She arrived at 11. You heard her first. Not engines. The sarcophagus doesn't have engines in any sense you'd recognize. What you heard was the sound of it not falling. The gravitic bed makes a tone when it works, a deep sustained note under the threshold of proper hearing, and it doesn't come in through your ears. It comes in through the long bones of your legs. 11,000 people all felt it at the same moment, and the crowd made a noise like a held breath. Then the light changed. The sarcophagus came down out of the cloud layer and it occluded. That's the only word. It was so large that the gray daylight dimmed under it, and the rain went strange, curving away from it in a wide bell, so that the ground under it was dry and everything around it was drowning. I have seen ships. I worked freight for 11 years. I have seen bulk haulers that you could park a city in. I had never seen anything like the sarcophagus, and I never will again. It was carved. That's what got me. Every square meter of that black gold hull, 240 meters of it, was worked with relief so fine that from where I stood I could see individual figures, hands, faces, banners, crawling across it in bands, and the bands stacked from the belly of it up to the spine, and each band was a century. It was a history, hung in the air, floating over a mining moon in the rain, and it was the single most beautiful object I have ever seen in my life, and I hated it instantly and completely. I don't know why. I've thought about that too. I think it was because the whole thing was so obviously not for us. It came down and it hung there, and it did not acknowledge that 11,000 human and Goron and Melee bodies were standing in the rain to look at it. It was a statement, and the statement was, "You are the ground." Vess said very quietly, "Well, yeah, that's a lot of money." I laughed. I shouldn't have. The sound carried, but I laughed, and a household guard 11 meters away turned its blank face toward me for exactly as long as it takes to note a thing, and turned it back. That's the first time one of them looked at me. It came down processional 9 at walking speed. The processional isn't a street exactly. It's the main hall corridor, 40 meters wide, cut straight through the rock and roofed with plate, and they'd stripped it out for the visit, pulled the cargo rails, blanked the loading bays, laid down a surface of some pale stone that must have cost more than my life. It ran a kilometer from the landing shelf to the assay hall, and every meter of it was lined with guard and crowd and rain. And under it, this is the part they will not tell you. This is the part that got buried in 11 inquiries. Under it, at the 2/3 mark, was Shaft 11. Shaft 11 was old. Goron cut, pre-treaty, back when the extraction was cruder and they went down after the Kessite in straight vertical bites instead of the spiral galleries they use now. It had been capped 40 years back. There was a plate over it and a survey mark, and it was on every map in the district, and it had never been a problem because nobody ever put anything heavy on it. Nobody had ever put 41,000 tons on it. Except, and here's the thing, here's the whole hinge of it, they hadn't. That was the design. The sarcophage floats. It never touches. Its whole point is that it does not touch. The engineers who signed off on the route knew about Shaft 11 and they wrote it in their assessment, and their assessment said, correctly, that a vehicle which never contacts the ground cannot load the ground. They were right. They were right in every particular, and I want that said. Because the Vel-Tarrin ended up executing 2 of them, and I don't think that was just. They were right, and then Core 4 failed. I'll tell you what it looked like from where I stood, and then I'll tell you what actually happened, because the 2 are different, and it took the inquiry 11 months to reconcile them. What it looked like. The sarcophage came level with us. It was so close I could see the individual carvings, a figure with 11 hands, a river, a burning tree. The tone in my leg bones was so deep it made my teeth hurt. The crowd had gone silent, the whole 11,000 of us, and the only sound was the rain and that impossible note. And then the note changed. It went sour. That's the only way I can put it. It slid, a quarter tone down, and it wobbled, and every single person in that crowd who had ever worked around machinery, which was all of us, everyone, went cold at the same instant, because that is the sound a machine makes when it is about to stop being a machine and start being a falling object. The sarcophage dropped 11 centimeters. Just that, a stumble, a little dip like a man missing a step, and it caught itself and the note steadied and I heard 11,000 people exhale. Then it dropped again and it did not catch. Here's what actually happened, from the report I was eventually allowed to read. The gravitic bed ran on 8 cores in a rosette. Any 3 could hold the load. Core 4 had a fault in a bearing lattice that had been flagged, logged, and scheduled for replacement at the next cradle refit, which was in 11 weeks. The fault was rated as non-critical. Under normal conditions it was. But the sarcophage had come down through Kessa's upper atmosphere, which is thick with suspended Kessite particulate. The whole moon is a lung full of the stuff, and Kessite is non-conductive to gravitic shear. It's an insulator. In a way nobody had modeled because nobody had ever flown a 41,000-ton gravitic vehicle through a Kessite fog, because there had never been a reason to. Core 4 ingested particulate. Core 4 lost coherence. Core 4 dumped its load onto cores 3 and 5. Cores 3 and 5 held for 11 seconds. Then 3 cascaded and 5 went with it, and the rosette lost a third of its ring, and the sarcophage's mass, all 41,000 tons of it, all 2,000 years of carved history, stopped being held and started being weight. It came down on processional 9 like a dropped anvil, and it came down directly on the cap plate of Shaft 11, and that plate had been rated in a treaty document 40 years ago for a maximum static load of 900 tons. The floor of the world opened up. I'd never heard a sound like it, and I hope you never do. It wasn't a crash. A crash is a thing that happens and stops. This was a tearing, deep and long, and it came up through my boots and into my knees, and it went on and on. The pale stone surface of the processional buckled in a wave, a visible wave, rippling out from under the sarcophage like water, and I watched a slab of it the size of a house tilt up and then vanish downward, and I never heard it land. And the sarcophage went into the hole. Not all at once. That's the horror of it, it wasn't clean. The bow came down and struck the far lip of the shaft and held, and the stern went down, and the whole 240-meter length of it tilted, rear first, into Shaft 11, and it wedged. Wedged, at maybe 30 degrees off level, stern down, bow up, jammed against the rock, with 180 meters of it in a hole that was 200 meters deep and full of 40 years of black water. The dust came out of the shaft in a column. It went up past the roof plates, and I lost sight of it, and the whole processional went dark and full of grit, and I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't see, and somewhere in the dark, 11,000 people were screaming. I got knocked down. I don't remember by what. I remember the ground being wet, and I remember Vess's hand around my arm hauling me up like I weighed nothing. And I remember him shouting something the translator couldn't handle. And I remember standing there in the roaring dark with grit in my teeth thinking, over and over, this is not happening. This is not a thing that happens. Then the dust thinned, and I saw it. The sarcophagus was hanging in the pit. It had gone in stern first and it had jammed, and the bow of it, 40-50 meters of it, still stuck up out of the hole into the corridor at an angle like the prow of a sinking ship. The carved reliefs were gone under a coating of black dust and shaft water. The gravitic bed was screaming, an audible scream now, a shearing whine that made your fillings ache, and it was firing. I could see the distortion boiling around the hull, blue-white wrong, but it wasn't lifting. It couldn't. 3 cores can hold 41,000 tons in free air. 3 cores cannot pull 41,000 tons out of a rock socket that has closed around it like a fist. It was stuck, and the rock was moving. I need you to understand this because everything else follows from it. The shaft wall was failing. The sarcophagus had gone into a 40-year-old Goron bore that had never been meant to take a lateral load, and its whole mass was pressed against one side of it, and that side was crumbling in slabs. I could see it. Everyone could see it. Every time a slab went, the sarcophagus dropped. Not far, 30 centimeters, half a meter, and settled deeper, and the bow came down a little more, and the angle got steeper. It was sinking slowly, slab by slab. And 200 meters down under the water was the stern, and the stern was where the court was, and the throne, and her. The guard reacted before the dust cleared. I've replayed this in my head 11,000 times and I still can't fix the sequence. One instant they were statues on the line. The next instant they were at the pit, all 400 of them, and I did not see them cross the distance. They didn't panic. That's what unmade me. There was no shouting, no scramble, no confusion. They arrived at the lip of that hole in a single coordinated wave, and they went to work like the whole thing had been rehearsed, and I realized with a sick, cold lurch that in some sense it had, that these were beings for whom the Empress falling into a hole was a scenario with a number and a protocol and a drilled response. They put 20 on the bow, magnetized to the hull, moving up the tilted deck like it was a floor. They put 80 on the rim with cutting gear I've never seen before or since. Handheld, no beam, just a place where the rock stopped being rock. They ran a line down into the dark and men went down it, into the water, into the stern. And they put 100 of them under the bow. I saw that and I didn't understand it. Vess did. Vess made a sound I'd never heard a Goron make. "They're going to hold it," he said. "What?" "The bow. They're going to hold the bow up." His eyes were all pointing the same direction, which for a Goron means something terrible. To slow the tilt, so the shaft doesn't crush the stern before they cut through. I looked at the 100 household guard forming up under 50 meters of overhanging velorite prow, and I looked at the prow, and I did the arithmetic that any hauler does automatically, because it's the only arithmetic that keeps you alive. The bow section overhanging that pit was maybe 9,000 tons of load, bearing down on a crumbling lip. 100 soldiers, 90 tons each. Vess said, "They can do it." "Nobody can do." "They can do it," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't place, and it took me 11 years to work out that it was awe and grief in the same breath. For a while, that's what they are. They can do it for a while. And they did. They got under it, and they took the weight. I watched 100 Vel-Tarrin household guard put their hands and shoulders against the underside of the sarcophagus and lift, and the tilt stopped. It stopped. 41,000 tons of state carriage sliding into a mine shaft, and 100 armored bodies stopped it, and the rock groaned and held. The crowd went insane. That's the word. 11,000 people who had been screaming started cheering, this ragged animal roar, because we'd all just watched something impossible and beautiful, and it was working. It was working, and the guard were going to hold the ship, and the divers were going to cut the stern, and everyone was going to be fine. I cheered too. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I stood there in the wet with the grit in my teeth, and I shouted until my voice broke. And then the shaft wall dropped another slab, and the sarcophagus settled 30 centimeters, and the load on the bow went from 9,000 tons to 11,000 tons, and I watched a household guard's leg fold. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing I can't get past. It wasn't a scream or a collapse or any of the things you'd write. His leg just folded, backward at the knee, in a way a leg is not supposed to fold, and he went down, and the armor kept the shape of him, and the shape of him was wrong. And the guard beside him stepped sideways into the gap, and took his share of the weight without a word. Then another one went, same way, the knee first, always the knee, then a third. And each time, the ones beside him closed up. And each time, the weight redistributed, and the remaining ones had a little more, and the shaft dropped another slab, and the load went up again. The cheering stopped. 11,000 people worked out the arithmetic at the same moment, and the sound they made when they worked it out was not a sound I can describe. They were going to break, all of them, one at a time, in silence, without moving, without a single one of them stepping back. And when the last one broke, 9,000 tons of Vel-Tarrin prow was going to come down on the pit lip and drive the whole sarcophagus into the shaft like a nail into wood, and everything and everyone inside it was going to be crushed to nothing under 200 meters of rock and black water. And they knew it, every one of them knew it, and not one of them moved. Vess said very quietly, "They will not stop. They have to. They will not stop." His 4 eyes were fixed on the pit. "They can't. They're not permitted to yield the load. That's the—" he made a sound like a stone splitting. "That is what the household guard is. They will hold until they are all broken, and then the Empress will die anyway, and every one of them will have been right." And something happened in my chest. I've never been able to explain this part to anybody's satisfaction. The psychologists want it to be a decision. They want a moment where I weighed things. There wasn't one. What there was this. I was standing in the rain, 40 meters back, behind a light barrier, in a crowd of 11,000 people, watching the strongest, oldest, most perfect soldiers in 11 systems break their bodies one by one in perfect silence, because they could not lift a thing that was too heavy to lift. And I thought, they're doing it wrong. That's it. That's the whole thought. It wasn't brave and it wasn't noble. It was the exact same thought I'd had 1,100 times in a cargo bay, watching some kid try to muscle a crate that outweighed him instead of using the geometry. They were pressing, all 100 of them, straight up into the belly of the thing, fighting the mass head-on with the mass falling straight down onto them. And it was the purest, most powerful, most beautiful piece of applied strength I had ever seen, and it was wrong. It was structurally, mechanically, stupidly wrong, because you do not fight a falling load. You change what it falls onto. I looked past the guard at the pit lip, at the way the sarcophagus's hull came down into the socket, at the ledge of rock on the near side that was taking nothing at all, because the ship had tilted away from it, and at the wedge of empty air between that ledge and the underside of the hull, maybe 2 meters of gap, maybe less, closing every time a slab went. And at the cargo rails. They'd stripped the processional for the visit, pulled the hull rails out and stacked them. 40-meter sections of Goron rail steel, laid in racks along the edge of the corridor, 11 of them, right there, 40 meters from where I was standing behind a light barrier eating a ration bar. Rail steel, compressive rating per section at short column, about 11,000 tons. I have never in my life done arithmetic that fast. I said out loud to nobody, "The rails." Vess said, "What?" And I was already moving. I went through the light barrier. You're not supposed to be able to do that. It's not a wall, it's a directive. It puts a pain field on you. It makes your legs stop working. That's the whole point of it. I hit it, and it hit me, and my legs did stop working, and I fell through it and got up on the other side with my knee bleeding and my hand not working right, and I kept going. I don't remember running. I remember the rack. I remember getting my hands on the end of a rail section, and I remember the weight of it, the good, honest weight of 40 meters of Goron steel, and I remember that it did not move. Because of course it didn't. It was 9 tons. I am one man with a bad shoulder. And I stood there for what felt like a year with my hands on that rail, and the ship sinking behind me and the guard breaking one by one. And I understood, completely and finally, that I could not do this. That I was a hauler second with a bad shoulder and a stupid idea, and I was going to stand here and fail while an empress drowned. And then Vess came through the barrier. He came through it like it wasn't there, and I found out later that it hurt him. It hurt him badly. Goron neurology takes a directive field about 11 times harder than we do, and he came through it anyway, and he put his plated shoulder against the rail beside mine, and he said, in a voice like gravel going through a grinder, "What is the plan, human?" And I told him. And behind him, coming through the barrier, was the melee kid from my bunk block who cried in his sleep. And behind him was a human woman I'd never seen, and 2 more Goron off the night shift, and a mine crew still in their dust with their cutting gear, and more and more. And I turned around, and there was a wave of them coming through that barrier. 11,000 people who had spent their whole lives being the ground, and they were coming because I had put my hands on a rail. I have never been so frightened in my life. We got the first rail up in 4 minutes. 90 of us on it. It's not a lot of steel per person when there's 90 of you, and the mine crews knew how to lift. They had the geometry in their hands. They didn't need telling. And we walked it up the processional through the grit and the screaming and the dark, and we came to the pit lip, and the household guard were there. And they were in our way. 40 of them, the ones not under the hull, formed a line at the rim, and their blank faces turned toward us, and the weapons that don't need aiming came level. The whole thing stopped. 900 people carrying a rail and 40 household guard, and about 2 meters between us, and behind them the ship sinking and their brothers breaking, and I could actually hear, the sound of a knee joint failing in the dark under that hull. I was at the front. Of course I was at the front. I was the idiot who'd started it. I put the rail down. I put it down on the stone, and I stood up, and I looked at a wall of Vel-Tarrin household guard, and I was a hauler second from a bunk block, and I said the stupidest thing I have ever said in my life. I said, "You're doing it wrong." Nothing happened for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. I counted them. I stood in the rain in front of 40 of the deadliest beings in 11 systems, and I counted 3 seconds, and I was so frightened I could taste it in the back of my throat like metal. And then one of them moved. Not toward me. It turned its blank face and looked past me at the rail. At 900 people holding 40 meters of Goron steel, at the pit lip and the ledge and the gap. And it looked at the gap for a long time. Then it turned back to me, and it did something I have never in my life been able to describe properly. It stepped aside. The first rail went in at an angle of about 11 degrees off vertical, but planted on the intact ledge, head jammed up under the hull plating at the point where the sarcophag's bow section began to overhang the socket. We didn't place it. We drove it. 900 people and 40 household guard, and the guard were stronger than all 900 of us together, and it didn't matter, because the strength was never the problem. The problem was that 11,000 tons was coming down, and it needed something to come down onto. The rail bit. The steel screamed, a high tearing note as it took load, and it bowed, visibly bowed, 40 meters of Goron rail steel flexing like a bent wire. And it held. And the sarcophage stopped moving. I want to be very careful here, because this is the part that got mythologized, and I hate what they did with it. The stories say I lifted the ship. There's a relief carved on the new processional now. I've seen the pictures. I won't go look at it. And in the relief, there's a human figure with his back under the prow of the sarcophagus and his arms straight, and the ship is rising. That is not what happened. That is a lie, and it's a lie in a language I recognize, because it's the same language that put 11,000 of us behind a light barrier in the rain. Nobody lifted anything. We put steel under it. That's all. We put steel under a falling thing so that it fell onto the steel instead of onto the soldiers, and then we put in more steel, and then more, and we did it for 9 hours in the dark and the rain with the shaft wall coming down in slabs around us, and 100 broken household guard being dragged out from under the hull by their brothers one at a time. 11 rails, that's what it took, 11 rails in 9 hours. And the reason it worked, the only reason it worked, is that I was a hauler. That's not modesty. That's the actual mechanism, and it's the thing the inquiry could never quite bring itself to write down. The household guard could have lifted more than we could. They could have lifted 10 times what we could. They had strength that made our whole species look like children. But nobody had ever asked them to move cargo. They'd never had to. They were the strongest thing in the room for 4,000 years, and when you are the strongest thing in the room, you never learn the geometry because you never need it. You just lift. Every problem is a lifting problem. Every load is a thing you get under. And they were so good at it, so unbelievably, magnificently good at it, that it took 41,000 tons and a 200-meter hole to find the place where it stopped working. We're not strong. We are so weak it's almost comic, but we have been moving things that are heavier than us for a very long time, and the whole of that history is a history of not lifting, of ramps and levers and rollers and wedges, of finding the angle, of the small, ugly, clever thing you do instead of the beautiful thing you can't. They had 4,000 years of strength. We had 400,000 years of not having any. That was the entire difference. That was all of it. Let me tell you about the 9th hour. By then it was bad. The rain hadn't stopped. Nobody had eaten. The mine crews had rigged lamps, and the lamps threw shadows that made everything worse. We'd lost people. I want that on the record, because it never makes it into the relief carvings either. A Goron named Toreb went into the pit when the ledge gave under him, and we did not get him back. A human woman whose name I never learned took a slab across the hips and died in the corridor about 11 meters from where I'm sitting when I tell this. The melly kid from my bunk block lost an arm and did not stop working, and when I tried to send him back, he clicked something at me that the translator rendered as "You are not the one who decides that," and he stayed. 22 of us died pulling that ship out of that hole. The household guard lost 61. 61. Under the hull, holding until we got the steel in. They never yielded the load. Not one of them. They held while their bodies came apart, and they went on holding, and when the rails took the weight and the guard could finally step out from under, only 39 of the 100 could walk. And here's what I saw at the 9th hour, and it's the thing I actually came to tell you. We got the last rail seated. The sarcophagus came up. Not much, half a meter, just enough to unwedge the stern, just enough for the 3 remaining cores to find purchase and bite. And the tone came back, the deep note in the leg bones, and it was steady. And 41,000 tons of carved history came up out of shaft 11 like a splinter coming out of a thumb. And it hung there, filthy, streaming black shaft water, 2,000 years of relief work coated in mud. And everybody stopped. 900 haulers and mine crews and night shift Goron and one-armed melee kids, and 39 household guard who could still stand, all of us standing in the mud looking up at that thing, and nobody made a sound. Not a cheer. Nothing. We were too tired to cheer. We just stood there with our hands hanging and looked at it. And then the sarcophagus opened. She came out onto the forward platform alone. I'd never seen a Vel-Tarrin. Not a real one, not in the flesh. She was tall, taller than a Goron, and thin, and her skin was the color of old paper, and she had a face that I want to describe and can't, except to say that it had too many places for expression, and all of them were being used at once. Her robes were soaked. That's the detail I kept. All that ceremony, all that 2,000-year house, and she came out onto the platform in robes soaked black to the knee with mine water, because the stern had flooded and she had been standing in it. She looked at the pit. She looked at the 11 rails, jammed in at their stupid angles, bowed and blackened, holding nothing now, having held everything. She looked at the 61 broken household guard laid out in a row along the corridor wall, and she looked at them for a long time. And then she looked at us. 11,000 of us by then. The whole crowd had come through the barrier at some point in the night, and nobody had stopped them, and nobody had gone home. We stood there in the mud, and the wreckage in our work clothes with our cutting gear and our bad shoulders, and we looked back at her. And I was at the front, because of course I was. She looked at me, directly, and I understood in a way I have never been able to make anyone else understand that she was seeing me, not a human, not a hauler, not an asset in a treaty appendix. Me. Odell Krayne, 34, bad shoulder, hums when nervous, has never in his life been looked at by anyone important. She opened her mouth to speak, and nothing came out. They wrote it up as the Empress was silent in acknowledgement of the debt. That's the official language. That's what went into the record, and that's what's carved on the new processional. It's not what happened. What happened is that she stood on that platform in her ruined robes with her mouth open, and she could not find the words. Not out of emotion. I want to be precise. Out of lack. The Vel-Tarrin state language has 11 registers for gratitude, and every single one of them is hierarchical. Every one of them is a formula for a superior acknowledging service from an inferior. And there are 900 of them, and she knew all 900, and not one of them fit. Because we hadn't served her. Nobody had ordered us. She hadn't asked. There was no contract, no clause, no appendix. 900 people who owed her nothing and got nothing had come through a pain barrier and picked up steel, and 22 of them had died for a woman most of them could not have named that morning. And she had no word for that. 4,000 years of empire and no word for that. So she stood there, and the rain fell on her, and she was silent. And then she did something, and I have thought about it every single day since. She came down off the platform, down the steps, into the mud in her soaked robes, and 39 household guard moved to stop her, and she said one word and they stopped. And she walked out across that torn-up ground, past the pit, past the bowed rails, past the row of her dead, and she came and stood in front of me. Close, close enough that I could see the mine water on her face. And she looked at me for a long moment. And she reached out and she took my hand, my right hand, the bad one, the one that never worked properly after the barrier, and she turned it over and she looked at the palm of it, at the torn skin, at the rail steel rust ground into it. And she pressed her forehead against it. There's no protocol for that. I found that out later. There is no ceremony, no precedent, no register in the Vel-Tarrin state language for what she did in the mud on processional 9 on the 8th of 5th month. The court scholars are still arguing. But the Goron understood it. Ves told me after, when they were bandaging my hand, and he was sitting beside me with his plating cracked open in 3 places and one eye gone. He said, "You know what that was?" "No." "It's ours. It's a Goron thing. The Vel-Tarrin took it from us 4,000 years ago and then made it illegal because they didn't like what it implied." He was quiet for a bit. "It's what you do at a grave, when someone dies doing something you should have done yourself." I didn't say anything. "She just told 11 systems that she was in your debt," Ves said, in a language she wasn't supposed to know, in front of every recorder on that hull. His remaining eyes closed. "You have no idea what you've done, human." I'll finish it quickly, because the rest is politics and I have no talent for politics. The hollow voice carried it. Of course it did. Every recorder on that hull, every relay. The whole architecture built to broadcast the Empresses will out across 11 systems with the tone intact. And what it carried that day was an Empress of the Vel-Tarrin standing in the mud of a mining moon pressing her forehead to a hauler's torn hand. They couldn't take it back. That was the beautiful thing. That was the funny thing, and I did laugh, eventually, months later in a room somewhere. They had built a machine to make sure that every corner of the empire felt exactly what she felt, and it worked perfectly, and it worked on the worst possible day. The treaties got rewritten. Not all at once, and not as much as you'd hope, and I'm told that's how it always goes. But the appendix that had humans as auxiliary logistical resources gone, and there's a human seat at the Kessa assay, and the household guard. This is the one I actually care about. The household guard took 11 human instructors into the cradle worlds the following year. Not to teach them to fight. God, no, there's nothing we could teach them about fighting. To teach them cargo. They ask me if I'm proud. That's usually the last question, and I never know what to do with it. Here's what I think about when I think about that day. It isn't the Empress. It isn't the hand. It isn't even Vess coming through that barrier, though that one gets me in the chest every time. It's the guard who stepped aside. That one. The one at the pit rim, with 40 of its brothers and a weapon that doesn't need aiming, looking at a filthy human with a bad shoulder who had just said you're doing it wrong to the finest soldier ever built. It could have killed me. It was supposed to kill me. Every line of its programming, every hour of its 4,000 years, every instinct in that armored body said that the thing in front of it was a piece of ground that had gotten above itself. And it looked at the gap, and it did the arithmetic, and it found that it was, in fact, doing it wrong. And it stepped aside. That's the moment. Not the ship, not the Empress. A being that had never in its life been wrong, standing in the rain, being wrong and moving anyway. I don't know if I could have done that. I honestly don't. I think about it and I don't know. 61 of them died holding that hull. 22 of us died putting the steel in. They're buried together on Kessa, on the ridge above the processional, in the same ground, which is the first time in 4,000 years that household guard have been laid anywhere but the cradle. There's no relief carving up there. No gold. Just the stone and the names and the rain, which never stops. I go up sometimes. Not often. My hand still doesn't work right and the cold makes it worse. And I stand there in the wet with 83 names in front of me, and I think the thing I always think, the thing I've never said out loud until right now. We didn't save her because we were strong. We saved her because we have always been the ones who had to move the heavy things, and somewhere back in the dark, before the ships, before the treaties, before anyone had ever thought to tell us what we were for, we learned that when a thing is too heavy to lift, you do not lift it. You get underneath it, and you find the angle and you hold. And you do not let go.